I know what you're all thinking. Out of all the Kirby games to review, you really picked this one? It's like going to an ice cream parlor and they have like 30 different flavors, but in the end you just end up picking Kirby Star Allies. I just think that this game is very interesting. It does a lot to stand out that no one really brings up. Kirby and the Forgotten Land, well, everyone's already talked about that. Everyone's played it. It's the best-selling Kirby game. What do I have to add? I only have multiplication problems. There's also Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, but I don't want to talk about Return to Dreamland. I want to talk about Kirby Star Allies. I played this game on lunch day and I liked it a lot. I really enjoyed playing with my family and how we could mix and match elements to our weapons, and how the game really encourages you all to work together with these fun little puzzles. It was great. Now, when the game released, it had pretty middling reviews. Maybe people didn't really like the ally system, thought it made the game too easy and unenjoyable, which is, fine, fair enough. Personally, I really enjoyed all that, but different strokes for different folks. Fast forward 5 years, it's gonna be 6 years soon. Synchronize your death watches, everyone. Now I've noticed that opinions on the game seem to have gotten a lot more negative. Like, people don't think the game's just okay anymore. They call it straight up bad now. It's probably due to the release of Kirby and the Forgotten Land as well as Return to Dreamland Deluxe that caused it. They do tend to be considered better games, so it just kind of damaged the perception of this one. This dampening view on the game is actually a big part of why I decided to make this video. I wanted to go back and see if I would feel the same way about it as everyone else. For my own opinion on the whole thing, would be fun. I should also add that the video is not going to go into the lore or any of that shit. I'll get into the story a little bit, but only talk about what's really present in the game. What's this? Where did this thing come from? What's the lore behind that? I don't care. Go watch someone else watching RPG Monger's lore video on it. Like I said, I'll still go over the story in the game since it's in the game, and the way they actually tell the story is very interesting. But I'll save that for later, we'll get to it when we get to it. Let's actually talk about the game now. In terms of gameplay, we should probably get the elephant in the room out of the way first. This game is best enjoyed with friends. In fact, I would say it's most enjoyable if you either play it with friends or treat the AI as your friends. The AI in this game is set up in a way so that, at least to an extent, it feels like you're playing with real people. This is what I truly mean when I say Kirby Star Allies is a multiplayer game. Not just that the multiplayer is the main focus, it's just not a single player game at all. Even when you're playing single player, you're still basically playing multiplayer. A kid's not always going to have a friend or family available to sit down and play video games with them, so the AI is supposed to help fill that void if it comes to be. I think it's a very interesting mechanic and I really enjoyed it. It never really feels like you're alone. Now, I know some people will have the argument saying that even if that's the case, the game should have still opened itself up in its design for someone that does want to choose single player experience. Even if this is how the developers intended the game to be played, shouldn't they still try to accommodate for people who want to play a game in their own way? And that's kind of a tough question. If you think about it, it's kind of the same conundrum as Dark Souls and the talk of whether or not it should add an easy mode. It opens up the game to more people, but it also kind of defeats the point of the game since the whole appeal of Dark Souls is that it's really hard. There's a lot of nuance here that people have been arguing forever and doesn't really have one right answer. That being said, there is something I noticed when it comes to people who have this argument. Many of the same people who say that Dark Souls should not have an easy mode are the same people that complain that Kirby Star Allies should accommodate them, and the game being this easy is dumb and bad. Get a little sidetracked here, but it always kind of bothered me, I tend to see this argument. If something is made for only kids and can't be enjoyed by adults as well, it's a lesser product. They should be enjoyable for everyone, but I don't think that's necessarily always true. The biggest example that comes to my mind is Blue's Clues. It's a show that can really only be enjoyed by kids, but not because the show's bad or only aims at the lowest common denominator, but because the way the show interacts with its audience. He'll ask the kids questions and get them to engage with what they're watching. That's really only something that will work with kids, because as adults we understand that the character on the television can't actually respond back. It's a show for kids and only kids, but it's not a bad one at all or lesser because of it. I sort of view the ally system very similarly. For a kid, they're probably less concerned with the single player experience and just want to play a game with their families or friends. And if they don't have anyone to play with, the allies will help replicate that feeling for them. Obviously, when we're playing alone, we understand the allies are just a stupid system that reacts to our actions and the world around them via ones and zeros. But for a kid, they'll feel real. And the usual arguments of things being made exclusively for kids is lazy doesn't really work here, since creating the allies was probably a lot of hard work. You have to allow all these different enemies to become playable with their own colors depending on which player number they are, with their own animations. Granted, they're probably just copy pasted over, but you still got to make sure those animations work. And if you don't have friends or family to play with, make a fairly complex pathfinding system for the computer players that allows them to advance through constantly shifting and changing level design. They put a ton of effort into a mechanic that would really only be enjoyed by by children. It's the opposite of lazy if you ask me. Now this isn't to excuse any problems that the game does suffer from. Trust me, we will get to that. I just don't think the ally system itself is one of them. Now that I got all that squared away, I should probably talk about the actual design of the ally system and how the whole game is built around it. Many of the levels are designed in a way that forces you all to coordinate and work together. The most obvious example being the one where you can like mix and match abilities. Unfortunately, it's not like how it is in Kirby 64 where every power-up can be combined and create a truly wacky combination. It's more of an extension of the one in Squeak Squad where you can apply an elemental power to a physical weapon. I will say, as a way of actually solving puzzles, it's a little lackluster. Most of the puzzle rooms you encounter almost always have the right power for what you need right in there. So it's not like I ever really had to figure out what to do. The only exception I can think of would be the puzzle room in the final world, where there was actually multiple power-ups you had to use and mix and match with each other to be able to complete the room. It had many layers to it, and I actually had to spend a couple of my brain cells to think about it. I liked it. I generally preferred rooms that were like a small challenge of some kind, like when you have a key and you need to get to a locked door, since I felt like I needed to put some effort into it. I mean, it was still easy. It's Kirby, but it was still more stimulating overall. And then you have the other half of what the ability combos are used for, beating the ever-living shit out of enemies and bosses. In that sense, they're a blast to experiment with and see how each element interacts with the weapons. There's actually a lot of variety in how they function and trying to find which combination works best for a certain level or enemy. A lot of the bosses have like specific weaknesses to an element, like Wispy with fire. You can freeze the water from Francisca's water gun with ice, which holds her in her place. Same with Kracko and the waterfall moves. Flamberge has a cannon where you can use water to put out the fuse that fires it. It's really fun trying to find these weaknesses for all these bosses, especially when you're going through the arena mode in this game. While I do wish there was something more akin to Kirby 64's ability mixing, I understand why they didn't go that route. That game was a much more slower, simplistic type. Each ability and each combination only had one action, which wouldn't really fit the style that Star Allies was going for. So I don't really mind this, where they have elements upon existing movesets. It also allows allies to be able to get in on the action, since they can have their weapons infused with elemental powers too, and other allies can give it to them whenever they need it. It also just really encourages not just the main player, but everyone to cycle out and try different weapons, elements, different enemies, all the time. It's just very fun to experiment with. I should also bring up these sections where your friends can take on some kind of form to help you progress through the level. You got Wheel, Bridge, Train, and Friend Star. These are pretty fun, but I feel like they don't really lend themselves well to the whole idea of allies working together. Like, yeah, sure, in-game we can see them form these things and work together, but here, in the real world, where we have to deal with taxes and disease and the economy, 3 of your friends are just going to be sitting there watching while one of you actually plays the segment having fun. I mean, for Wheel, you all can theoretically control it, but why the hell would you want to do that? The only one that feels somewhat cooperative is the Friend Star, since you can switch out the leader and each element can have its own unique attributes to the attacks, meaning that potentially everyone has an opportunity to be useful while playing. It's just unfortunate because you got this whole thing of allies working together and then all that's stripped away from you for these segments. They could have done something similar for the other forms where you're all forced to work together, like with the Friend Wheel. You can make it where only the person who's touching the ground can actually jump. Now, I know that sounds awful. I literally did just say everyone controlling the same wheel is bad, but I think the big difference here would be that it requires more coordination. You'd have to be paying attention to where your placement on the wheel is so you can jump when it's your turn to do so. You would have to make the wheel slower and probably a bit bigger, just to make it more clear when someone has to jump so it's not too frustrating, but I feel like there's potential there with that idea. The bridge? You could probably have it where people on each side can independently move, allowing you to actually tilt the bridge, but the two in the middle would still have nothing to do. You could also have it where the 4 players are just separate, forming their own bridges, and they move independently from each other, so they can pass the monkey along to help get them across. You know, like the monkey travels through the first person, and they travel upwards to pass it to the next, and so on and so forth. Like, I feel like there's some interesting ideas you could do there. The train, you could have it where if one person messes up, the whole thing derails. I just feel like there's a whole lot more that could be done here. It's not too bad in single player since, well, it's just you controlling it, and maybe that's why it is the way it is. Like, my idea for the bridge wouldn't really work if it was single player, like switching controls of the allies or them just doing it themselves. It would probably just be a little cumbersome and annoying, so this was just easier. They do make great spectacles though, and in the epilogue story, they can actually be kind of challenging, having to make quick, breakneck decisions. There's something else that the ally system does to affect the level design, and this time it's exclusively about the computer AI aspect of it. And I'm not talking about how it affects the difficulty. To be honest, I find it pretty standard for a Kirby game. The fun of Kirby's never really been its hardcore difficulty, so they have to make each one leave some kind of impact with a unique idea, setting, or gimmick. Especially in some of the later Kirby games like Triple Deluxe and Robobot, those games have such a strong sense of theming that really stick with you when you play them. For Star Allies though, I've come to notice that a lot of the unique ideas that the game does have tend to get repeated a lot. Like, they got repeated in previous games too, but they really take this to an extreme. Like, they use the idea of shifting landscapes and moving blocks a lot. It's like half of the stage's gimmicks. But to be fair, they do a good job making them all feel different. They have this one where the ceiling's crushing you and you need to move to the right spot. There's this one that's basically a sliding block puzzle that I really enjoyed. The final level feels like you're traversing an earthquake since the ground keeps shifting, making the lava exposed to damage you. They really try their best and I commend them on that, but some do rely on the same tricks with very little variation. The conveyor belt gets repeated a few times throughout the game, and these ones don't really feel different at all. It's like they took one level and just kind of broke it into 3. What does any of this have to do with the AI? Well, you see, making an AI is a very complicated matter. In basic terms, if you program an AI to do well with one thing, it's only going to be good at that one thing. The moment you throw something new at it, you're going to have to retrain it all over again. Now, I know the AI in Kirby isn't really comparable to advanced AI. Hell, it's not even real AI. It's more of a very complex pathfinding system. But you know, a similar idea is there. I've connected the dots. You can program it to redirect and pathfind to react to specific objects so that it can somewhat move forward. But the moment you throw a new element at it, you're gonna have to go in and reprogram it to properly interact with that one too. And you'll need to do that every time you add an entirely unique element. They can't make the levels too complex in layout since while the AI is impressive, they're still not entirely efficient. Kirby ain't gonna be making breakthroughs in the scientific field of AI development. So to reduce the AI getting stuck and getting themselves killed, all the levels are programmed in a way so that they can react to the elements in it appropriately. And one of the ways the AI is most likely specialized in doing so is changing terrain. It's why so many levels use that gimmick like shifting blocks and conveyor belts, since the AI can be placed in multiple levels with no issues. If they make an incredibly unique gimmick that only appears once and never again, and interacts with the stage in an odd way, they would need to go in and program a unique interaction with that object that will never appear again. That would be way too much work. So instead, they take a handful of mechanics they made that are broad enough so that they could get a lot of mileage out of it, and they do a pretty good job doing so. I'd say the first 3 worlds, you probably aren't even going to notice that's what they're doing. The gimmick of being able to move the ground and dodging how obstacles shift around you is very malleable, and they're able to get a lot of creative ideas out of it without it feeling like you're treading over old ground. And it's not to say that on the occasion there isn't a mechanic that only appears once, but it's very rare. Like these spinning blades, I'm sure these only appear at maximum twice. It's just so rare that that's the only example I can think of. Unfortunately, by the time we reach the final world, it really does feel like the developers are stretching themselves thin in terms of getting ideas out of these handfuls of gimmicks, because they really start to just kind of blend together at this point of the game. You know what, let's just go over the final world now, since I really do feel like it's the low point of the game. I want to ask you guys a question. When you think of a final world of a game, what comes to mind? Lava, probably. Lots of lava. Too much fucking lava. Every game likes to have a lava world. It's a pretty tired trope, but the real question is why? Why do games like to make their final worlds have a lava world? Aside from the fact that Mario did it and everyone's a copycat. It's because it's the finale. Fire and lava are intimidating, and it really feels like you're invading the lair of a final boss. It's not just the end because the game says so, it feels like the end. And it doesn't have to be lava themed. In Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, the final world decides to be a little quirky and do a snow and ice theme instead. But it still feels like it's the end game because it's your home. You see how every level is a world from the previous game now invaded and covered in ice. Makes you want to take it all back from those little bastards. Even just how they structure it can help. Mario Wonder decides to kind of drop the lava theme and instead have Bowser introduce each level himself, hyping each one up until you finally reach him. Now, what does Star Allies do with its structure themes? Grass, beach, snow, more snow, snow again, why is there 3 different snow levels, and fire? It seems pretty weird and disappointing, honestly. Like, we already did this gimmick back on Popstar. You couldn't think of anything else? And yeah, the structure in the background looks somewhat alien, but it's not really that noticeable. It doesn't even have to be completely out there ideas, just something different we haven't seen. Like, why not a planet that's like Alcatraz? It makes the endgame feel a little bit underwhelming since it doesn't really leave a massive impact on you. As cliched the final lava world might be, it gives those games a sense of finality. That's probably why the ending of this game just kind of comes out of nowhere, and why the overall game feels short despite being the same length as any other Kirby game.
There's no build-up. If they wanted to keep this whole hopping to planet thing before you make it to the final area, I think a cool idea they could have done is when you start, the planets are peaceful and unaffected, but each time you get closer to the final boss, you see more of their control and influence, taking over these ecosystems and invading these planets. You'd be able to progressively feel the endgame approaching with each planet, but they don't do that, and unfortunately that's not the only reason why this world feels lame, because gameplay-wise, I think it's the most boring. Most of these levels just really don't stick out to me at all. I mentioned how the developers made a handful of stage mechanics that they reused throughout the game. Here it can really feel like they're starting to run on fumes for ideas on these things. The level with the block sliding is the one that I thought was the most interesting. You have to react quickly and pray to God that your allies won't die, just for then God to put you on hold. I really enjoyed it, but that's kind of the only one that really stood out to me. So with no real standout gimmicks for the levels, combined with no real strong theme, the final world is just so bland and forgettable, which is really unfortunate, since the other three worlds did such an amazing job making each level feel distinct, even with its limited pool of gimmicks. I already mentioned it, but the Jam Bastion is just fantastic. It's an entirely unique setting. I love how the level design actually fits with where you enter in the overworld. I love how they introduced the sisters. I love the names of the levels and how they changed. Honestly, they should have just flipped the third and fourth world. When you find the last Jamba Heart, it flies off, or one of the sisters snatch it, so you planet hop until you make it to their ship. Then you invade the thing until you encounter Highness. Like, the final level in the Jam Bastion leaves such a better impact as a finale. The whole ending after one of the sisters destroys the core and the whole place is collapsing, so you have to use the things like the wheel, the bridge, and the friend star to escape. It's all just so exhilarating. This should have been the final level that led up to Highness. Alright, well, I suppose all that's left to talk about in the main story mode is the finale. When you finally make it to their headquarters, you encounter Highness. And the entire segment after this is kind of like a large boss gauntlet. There's like 5 phases in total. Each phase doesn't really last long, so there's no part that overstays its welcome. It also feels like every time you defeat a phase, there's a natural escalation that keeps the momentum up throughout the entire fight. The first part is with Highness. He was just kind of limply floating around, barely attacking. Kind of feels like we're just beating the shit out of an elderly person with really bad arthritis. We knock his hood off and he goes crazy after his secret identity is revealed to be
Tortellini! Will I ever win?
This is kind of where the real fight begins. He summons his underlings and starts wailing their lifeless bodies all over the place. He's using them as meat shields, so throughout the fight you have to time your attack so they actually do damage towards him when he's poking his ugly head out. I also like how he turns into the friend circle with the corpses. He's kind of like a bizarro version of Kirby when you think about it. Kirby does these stunts with his friends that are willing to do it with him and work together because they're a team. Meanwhile, Highness is forcing it upon their will and uses them more as a means to an end. He's a prick. After you defeat him, he decides to take desperate measures to revive his master by sacrificing the 3 mage sisters and then himself. This part is when we transition into the true final boss, Void Termina. The fight has 2 different halves with 4 segments in total. I'll start on the inside sections. In here, you gotta tear his heart open, revealing the thing inside, Void, which has Kirby's face. Oh, look at him, he's so cute. Look at him. You see that? Isn't that adorable? I'd cuddle with that. This thing is the true final phase, and it'll go hog wild on you, throwing attacks left and right, bouncing into the background so you can't hit him, able to turn your allies against you. He even transforms into dark matter halfway through. It's nuts. The outside fight where you take on Termina doesn't actually have a whole lot that's going on. It's more of a spectacle, something that more impresses you with its scope and leaves a lasting impact on you. It was the first time a Kirby game's gone 3D, except for the other times when he's gone 3D. Void Termina is very large, imposing, crashing down, flying around, shooting beams in every direction. It's a masterpiece. The escalation, how it tells its story, the impact, the final attack when you fire your best fucking friend beam to murder him off, it's just immaculate. While the ending might not have really helped with how the whole last world made me want to go into a coma, it does ultimately feel very satisfying and ends on a good note. To end things off, I'm going to go over the story real quick and then talk about the way the game tells its story because I think it's actually rather interesting. This character here, his name is Highness. He was trying to revive the Dark Lord, but like he fucked it up and all the pieces kind of scattered everywhere. His followers, the 3 mage sisters, go and try to clean up the mess, but unfortunately for them, many of the Dark Hearts landed on Popstar because it's the center of the universe, I guess. I swear, eventually these developers are probably going to think of an explanation on why this planet's always getting caught in the crossfires of these kind of things. Anyway, this is when Kirby starts his adventure, and he goes through the game, meets the mage sisters as well as Highness. Highness gets defeated by Kirby, obviously, and he sacrifices the 3 mage sisters to revive Void Termina. We go out our way to defeat that guy and save the day. Pretty straightforward in terms of surface level stuff, but of course, there's a lot more to these characters and their motivations for why they're doing what they're doing. I said I'm not going to be talking lore, but I should probably discuss the stuff directly related to these guys. So basically, a long time ago, Highness was part of a group of magic men that worked together with the science guys. Unfortunately, the science guys were kind of pricks and they banished Highness and his people, which left him rather pissed. So over the years, Highness developed a plan of revenge. In the meantime, the three mage sisters were all dying in very horrific ways until Highness came along and saved them. Kind of messed up how their elemental powers are directly related to how they almost died. It's like a constant reminder. Like, imagine you were trying to kill yourself and then the power you gained was being really good at tying knots. A second attempt would probably follow not too far behind. They developed a loyalty to Highness because of it. It's why they're helping him. Unfortunately, Highness kind of went a bit crazy over the years and he doesn't really view them as people anymore. It's actually a deep story about how the ones who once cared for you can slowly lose themselves. How people you trust can turn their backs on you. It's actually rather profound. Like, I actually really feel for the three mage sisters here. They had nothing, and then near their final moments found something again, just for that something to once again be lost. Now, in an update after the game's release, it got this epilogue that explains what happened to the gang after Void Termina got defeated. They somehow got stuck in another dimension. There's not a whole lot here, it's more just to give these characters a second chance to be happy, since it consists of the Mage Sisters finally opening their eyes and seeing that Highness is just not the same person he was when he saved them all those years ago, by having Kirby beat shit out of him. Kirby would make a terrible husband. Even Highness gets a second chance after having a tiny friend heart land on top of him. It's really sweet. Overall, I think this actually might be the best Kirby story, at least in my opinion. Unlike previous games that have these tragic figures that just kind of end in more tragedy, here we get to see them grow and evolve, actually try to be happy for once. That's something Tyranza's never gonna have. Despite not really seeing them a whole lot throughout the game, the writers did a good job leaving an impact on you with very subtle writing that gives these characters and their relationships with each other much more depth. It's very impressive if I'm being honest. I can really understand why so many people became obsessed with these guys. Now, while the story is good and I enjoyed it, there's another aspect of it that I enjoyed even more.
The story progression. I really like what they did here. Most platformers usually just set up the story where the main goal is obvious from the start, and the entire game is either just traveling to it or collecting something that allows you to access the area you need to get to. It's very stagnant, which makes sense. For the most part, it's just an excuse to travel from level to level, and this kind of story is perfect for a setup like that. Even other Kirby games do this, traveling from location to location to get to the final area to beat the shit out of something. But Kirby Star Allies does something very different, where each world has a different story goal in mind. In the first world, Kirby is completely unaware of all the cult shit that's going on in space. He just sees King Dedede stealing food again and goes over to stop him. Once he does, that's when we learn about the Jamba Hearts, and the second world's about investigating what these things are and why they're influencing the denizens of Dreamland. The third world's all about investigating this giant station that invades Popstar, so you and your friends infiltrate it to see what's going on. It's only when you make it to the end of this world where the main goal makes itself obvious. You must get to the three Mage Sisters' home base and put a stop to their leader before he brings on ultimate destruction. The final world then becomes the classic make your way to the final boss and defeat them sort of deal. I really enjoy that there's actual progression here, and how your goal changes and evolves throughout the course of the game. I think it makes the story a lot easier to get into, rather than just having it all left to the very end of the game. The other games had their own ways of fleshing out characters. Maglor was always in the ship, so you could talk to him plenty of times throughout the game and learn more and more things about him and your mission and everything else, which kind of makes the end hit even harder. In Planet Robobot, Susie pops up after the third world and occasionally pokes her head back in every once in a while, but for the most part it's still backloaded at the end of the game. But I think Star Allies did it the best. Like, when you meet the three Mage Sisters, it's in the context that you're invading their ship and they want to get rid of you. You meet with them, learn who each one is, get a taste of their personality, all in a context that makes sense. Not only that, but I really enjoy the subtle detail of how the naming scheme of the levels change throughout the worlds. When you're on Popstar, it's all fun alliteration with cute and cuddly names that we would all expect from Kirby, like Donut Dome and Honey Hill. But then when you enter the Jamba Station, the level names become very cold, straight to the point. Eastern Wall, Sector A, Inner Sanctum. Really sets the mood. I also like how they handle the level themes throughout the game. Since World 1's in Dreamland, you go through very familiar areas that don't stray too far from the nice grassy theme. And then in the second world, since you're traveling around Popstar, each level is corresponding to what level theme was in Return to Dreamland. Kind of similar to what Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze did for its final world. And the Jam Bastion is entirely unique. Very dark and filled with very off-putting architecture. I also like how the location of the station you're on reflects in the level. Like on the western outer wall, since the next level is above, the Inner Sanctum, the level itself is all about climbing vertically. It's really clever in how it's all laid out. It is admittedly pretty unfortunate that the final world does kind of drop the ball as hard as it does.
since it does kind of mess with the whole pacing of it, and it doesn't really make the whole lead up to the final ending as dramatic as it should have been. But in the grand scheme of things, in terms of story, I think that's more of a minor hiccup than anything. I feel like the way they structured this thing was expertly crafted. I liked it a lot. Do you guys think King Dedede says slurs? And that's kind of the end of the main game. Before I get into the conclusion though, there is some other stuff that I have to talk about first. Because the main campaign, while is, the main part, there's actually a substantial amount of side modes that I want to go over. And before I talk about those, I should talk about the update cycle since, there were some substantial updates after launch. So I guess I should briefly go over that, huh? Yeah, this game, when it launched, had post-launch updates. Now, they aren't actually that much. They added new Dream Friend characters that were like legacy characters from previous mainline games. Characters like Gooey, Adeline, Taranza, and so forth. The only update that really brought something entirely new was the final one that brought the campaign Heroes of Another Dimension with new levels built around each copy ability in Dream Friend. People really hated this whole update thing at the time, saying that it made the game feel incomplete and that this was held back content, which to an extent I understand. Looking at the main campaign, I wouldn't agree with that. It's about as long as any other Kirby game of the series. But when you look at the side modes, there is actually a substantial lack of content there compared to something like Triple Deluxe or Planet Robobot. Because look at the side modes in this game, what do you have? We want to play some log champs? Meteor Smash? Kirby Planet Robot had an entire side mode that put Kirby into 3D space with its own little levels. So I can kind of understand the complaint. While I don't think the game was necessarily incomplete, it did feel lackluster, and the update cycle just did not help with that in the slightest. So they kind of fumbled the ball there. So much so that the next Kirby game wouldn't even get an update, not even a patch.
Since I brought it up talking about the update cycle, I think it's appropriate that I talk about Heroes from Another Dimension. So after Highness and the sisters got flung out into space and somehow travel to another dimension, Kirby and friends follow suit, and we have to travel through these dimensions to help them out. The structure in this mode is a bit different from the main game. Each section has it where you're assigned an ability or dream friend, and all the rooms are heavily designed to use everything these characters have in their arsenal. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Rick, Kine, and Ku show off what I mean the best. At one point, you have to hold the key, which means you can't use any abilities, but the gap is far too large to get across. So what do? Well, you use Rick to jump on the enemy's psychic attack as well as the enemy itself, because Rick is actually able to jump on enemies and attacks without getting hurt because his ass is just that thick. I didn't even know he could do that. There's this other part with Susie later where you have to combine her with wind so that she can fly and cut these chains. Another thing that I didn't know she could do. So they really force you to use everything in these characters' arsenal. Some of them actually took me a little time to figure out how to grab them. The puzzles in this mode are far more in-depth and interesting, actually requiring me to think. I mean, some of them are that whole you got one shot and if you mess it up, you're screwed, which can be rather annoying if I'm being honest. If that happened, I would just die and try again. And unfortunately, not all of them have an easy way for you to kill yourself if you mess up. In the friend circle section near the end, I screwed up the last jump, and the only way for me to die was to slowly get killed by this guy, which was difficult in of itself since my allies kept beating the shit out of him. And when I did die, for some reason it started me on the other side of the map. I get the feeling that the developers didn't really consider that an insane person would be playing their game. There's also this one segment here with Adeline that took 10 fucking minutes. So you have to break these blocks to match the layout of the blocks in the previous room. For the final one though, I had Dark Meta Knight, who has the wonderful ability to attack with his wings. So when I was down there trying to break the blocks, he'd fly up, destroying some of them, ruining the whole thing. I would get rid of him, but you can't get rid of Dream Friends. How do they overlook this? But aside from those admittedly very frustrating instances, it was very fun to make your way through. After all, we face off the three Mage Sisters at the same time. It's really cool, especially considering that they have an actual special attack here. The ability to slow the switch down and give it a fucking stroke, as well as giving me one, because it's pretty hard to see what the hell is going on with all the three sisters flying around, as well as your allies throwing shit all over the place. I would say it was for the spectacle, but that would imply that I understood what the fuck was going on. It's a nice conclusion though. It gives closure to Three Sisters as well as Highness, as we see him get cleansed of darkness, at least somewhat. I'm sorry I beat you, Partisan. I was in a dark place. Now I can talk about all the other side modes. I guess I should go more in depth with Chop Champs and Meteor Smash since, well, I mean, they're here. It's so weird. For a franchise known for having significant side modes, these feel
very lacking in comparison. Hell, Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe released recently and has like 10 minigames all like this with achievements and all that. They almost feel out of place. Well, anyway, guest star mode. This is pretty similar to modes like DDD Tour and Triple Deluxe or Return to Meta Nightmare in Planet Robobot, where you go through this truncated version of the main story in one long session. In this version of the game, there's like these stat boosters you can find that increase attack power, health, and your speed. And unlike the previous two modes, in this you can pick any ally or dream friend to play through. They all even have their own little cute titles. For my first run though, I picked Rocky, and looking back in hindsight, that was a terrible idea, since he basically has no real moveset, just rock and uppercut. You can turn into a curling sometimes, that was cool. The dream friends are the most interesting since they actually have some rooms entirely unique to them and them alone. Like when you go through Magalore, they actually recreate some of the levels from Return to Dreamland. Like when you reach this section here with him, you have to use his giant sword to break these blocks that replicate the super abilities in that game. They even did a grayscale section, which is pretty cool. It's also fun to like fight the bosses when you have max attack power, because like, damn, what poor pitiful fools. The ending is also different. You face off Galactonite, except psych, idiot! You actually fight against this new foe called Morpho Knight, who has a butterfly fuse with him or something. I don't know, I never watched Dragon Ball. It's a great end, but since you most likely have max attack power at this point, you're able to just completely decimate him, so you really won't be able to appreciate the fight until you fight him at Ultimate Choice, which we'll talk about later. It's a straightforward mode, although if you want to 100% complete the game, you gotta go through it with every dream friend, which definitely sounds like someone's hell. Probably this guy's. I don't think he'd like it very much. And then you have Ultimate Choice. Do I really need to go into detail about this? It's the boss rush. Most Kirby games have it. The minor difference with this one is that you have like a difficulty slider. There's also an ultra secret hard mode that fucking kicked my ass trying to get through it. I always enjoy this mode because it really allows me to appreciate the boss fight and combat, and really shows how well put together it all is. Kirby boss fights have always been rather deep. Like in the later stages, they really push you to use your block and dodge to be able to maneuver around some of these attacks. And in this game's case, bosses have weaknesses that you can use to your advantage. It's probably why this mode is always so popular in this game compared to other boss rushes, since they're just much more deep and intricate. It's a lot more fun to figure your way around rather than just bop them on the head 3 times. And, well, that's the game. No, it's not. Is it obvious that I really like this game? Maybe not. I did have a decent amount of complaints. It's definitely a unique experience. The ally system really dictates everything in this. If you're someone who doesn't really like the idea of playing a platformer with friends or playing with a bunch of computer AIs, then just don't bother. You're not going to like what this game has to offer. But for me, I found it to be incredibly enjoyable, especially with family and friends. To be honest, when playing with others, the issues with these games become a lot less noticeable, at least for me. Like a lot of the issues of the final world and the oversimplistic puzzles was only something I noticed when replaying the game in single player. That doesn't mean they aren't issues, and honestly, when playing with family, critically thinking of the level design was not exactly on the forefront of my mind, since I was more just thinking about enjoying my time with the family. Thinking about it now, I think the focus on multiplayer is also probably why the side modes are a little lackluster. Instead of trying to make these larger single player experiences, they wanted to make a couple of party games that you could play with people, but they fell a little flat on their faces there. These just weren't fun to play with others. They're too basic. It doesn't help that Return to Dreamland Deluxe does this concept a lot better, so yeah, hindsight fucking killed these with no chance of recovery. Guest star mode is also really great, but out of all of them, it's the one I played by myself the most, since, my family doesn't want to play through these games 3 times over for hours on end. They got actual lives to live. So I would just try my best to speedrun through, which was very enjoyable. And of course, Ultimate Choice is the standard boss rush, and Soul Melter makes me want to melt my own soul. Kirby Star Allies is one of those games that, despite its flaws, I just can't help but enjoy. Yeah, it's not my favorite Kirby game, but I'll still gladly replay it, which I'll probably do again and again with many different people over the years. I think it's kind of unfortunate that this game is viewed in such a negative light. I always love going back and replaying games, seeing how my thoughts and opinions change. Sometimes I grow more negative towards a game on replay. Sometimes I love a game even more. And for Kirby Star Allies, my feelings are exactly the same. I love this game. So why won't it return my calls?